I hope everybody's dug out mostly now. If you came to see Jens Helka, I'm sorry to disappoint. I'm actually Andy Wood. I'm substituting for Jens on this webinar, but I was closely involved in the development of this latest update to Vermont Conservation Design. So I'll be doing the first 2/3 of the presentation, and then Dave's gonna take over on the back half. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. Keep yourself muted so we can cut down on background noise. And if you could type your name and the town or organization that you're part of into the chat, that's really helpful for us to know who's coming to these webinars. Definitely put questions or comments you have in the chat, and we'll pause several times throughout the presentation to take some live questions or catch up on the activity that's happened in the chat. But before I get a little further, I'd just like to tell you a little bit about where we're coming from. At the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, we believe in the conservation of our fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for the people of Vermont. It's a really big mission. Takes our staff in a variety of different directions and working at a bunch of different scales. But it's an exciting mission, one that we're working really hard at every day. The community wildlife programs piece of this larger mission is offering free technical assistance to Vermont municipalities on all issues related to conservation planning. Everything from presentations and workshops to support with mapping and prioritization and helping to better understand ecological and community context. So that's Jens and Dave as the community wildlife program staff. Our presentation today is going to be divided into 4 segments. First, we're going to think about why VCD? Why would we do this work, and what does this work do for us? Then we'll think about Vermont Conservation Design as a prioritization and talk about issues of context and scale. The next segment, we'll get into the different parts or components of the design and share a little bit of the new updates. And lastly, Dave's going to take over and speak to how you can apply the design to work in your town. And as I said, we'll have some slides marking where the breaks are. So big picture, Vermont Conservation Design, or VCD for short, is a science-based vision to sustain the state's valued natural areas, forests, waters, wildlife, and plants for future generations. So VCD is the data and the vision, and BioFinder is the website and interactive mapping platform that's available to everyone online. So it is both a single map as well as a series of different component maps that stack up to the whole big picture. It is a statewide prioritization that identifies the ecologically most important lands and waters in Vermont. So where are these places? And then conceptually, it's also a vision for the future that if we adequately steward and protect these places, it will maintain nature and its benefits and provide our conservation partners with a framework for directing their actions and resources. So we'll pick up on each of these points in the coming slides. Big picture, who cares, right? Why is this important? Well, as a biologist, I think the first answer to that question is that the design maintains nature and the benefits that it provides. So ecologically, a connected and intact and diverse natural landscape. It helps us conserve species and natural communities, and it allows us to adapt to a changing climate. So that's why I care about VCD and why I think many others do as well. But there's other things at play here too. This ecologically functional landscape also sustains ecosystem or environmental services like clean air and water, carbon sequestration, and flood protection. So while we are looking to keep large areas of unfragmented forest, those areas are also filtering pollution and providing clean air. The unfragmented forest blocks, the vegetated riparian areas, and the undisturbed wetlands, those are all essential for providing clean water and protecting water quality.
Completely fine.
Yeah, I just tried.
Okay. I love the snow.
Sorry, I think we've just got some unmuted chatter there. Undeveloped riparian areas and unhindered natural dynamics of rivers and streams will provide flood protection and flood resilience. As we maintain all of Vermont's natural habitats to protect pollinator species such as native bees and other species that are essential for natural ecosystems, well, those are also pollinating our important agricultural crops, including apples, blueberries, tomatoes, and squash. And there's the snowblower hitting my house right now, so sorry for that noise. So, this is a natural climate solution that provides resilience in the face of climate change. And an intact, well-connected natural landscape is allowing our plants and animals to naturally shift locations in response to climate change. By allowing ecosystems to arrange and self-adapt, this is the single best strategy we have to ensure the continuation of essential environmental services in a changing climate. All of this work is also supporting our social and economic values like working farms and forests. A well-managed forest provides many benefits to landowners and the public, including timber, other non-timber forest products, clean air and water, wildlife habitat, carbon sequestration and storage, and recreational opportunities. So by maintaining well-managed forests and the economic incentives to keep forests intact, it's critical to sustaining the whole ecologically functional landscape envisioned in Vermont Conservation Design. Needless to say, this is also going to support our outdoor recreation economy and help us maintain our rural character and natural beauty. Vermont Conservation Design is protecting the state's unique identity, heritage, and iconic features that Vermonters and visitors value. From forested hillsides to our fall foliage, our clean flowing rivers, and our fish and wildlife. So while this began as a science project a number of years ago, focused on prioritizing lands and waters important for biological diversity and climate resilience, it's clear that the design supports a much larger set of community values. And that's something we're really excited to continue exploring in the coming years with this newest iteration of the data. So let's pause there and just see if there's any questions in the chat at this point. Dave, if you can take any volunteers or read out any questions from the chat, I'm happy to answer.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Andy. Well, welcome again, folks. I know there's some of you who joined us during this first segment. We're going to have a couple opportunities to take a break for questions, but I also want to invite you at any point that you have a comment or a question in response to the presentation to just put that right down in the chat. And we'll be monitoring the chat as we present different segments, and at these breakpoints, we can then read those questions out. We do have a quick opportunity, since there are no current questions written in the chat, to take a live question at this segment, if anyone has one, just on our introduction. Otherwise, we'll move right into the next segment. If you have a question, feel free to raise your hand with the raise hand icon at the top of the toolbar there. But otherwise, it seems like, Andy, back to you. Let's go right to section 2.
Sounds good. Thanks, Dave. So what's new in the 2023 update? We are continually updating VCD and the accompanying BioFinder website to share the most up-to-date science information we have. So the 2023 version that we're talking about today is the 4th time we've updated the BioFinder website with the newest science, and that's live, and you can go poke around today if you've got nothing else to do. So the first new data product I'm going to talk about is the habitat blocks data set. And this data set is really at the heart of VCD and many of the landscape scale data layers that we'll get into later in the presentation. So what do I mean by habitat block? This is an area of natural cover surrounded by roads, development, and agriculture. And this is one of the basic units in our conservation planning efforts. And you may hear us use that word interchangeably with forest blocks, and that's because in Vermont, our habitat blocks are overwhelmingly forest. But they do include streams, wetlands, shrublands, cliffs, and other types of natural cover. When you look at the distribution of the sizes in these habitat blocks as we've mapped them, they range in size from 20 to over 150,000 acres. There are, blocks smaller than 20 acres, of course, but they are not included in this data set. So we created this first in 2011, and the input data at that time was much coarser. It had a larger land cover pixel size. And so, the mapping was very blocky and the edges were a little rough. The new input data we've used this time around is vastly superior. It's 3,600 times more detailed than what we had previously. So extremely powerful new land cover data for showing the edges of these habitat blocks, as well as connection points between various forest blocks. That's giving us new exciting insights into understanding both local and landscape scale connectivity. Just a quick note that, when we're talking about, the forest that contributes to these habitat blocks, we're including all successional stages, including recently harvested forests that are in the process of regenerating. Those are all parts of the habitat blocks. And these are real features you can go out and experience on the ground. Our mapping is showing them more accurately than ever before, but just, to be clear, it's not just data. These are ecological features that exist in some of your backyards. So let's take a look at a couple places, and I'll show you some of the improvements that have come in this new data set. So here's a site in Goshen. Here's just the aerial image on the bottom left. In the yellow is the old habitat blocks data set, and on the right is the new data set. On the left, that sort of pixelated blocky shape I was speaking about earlier, you can kind of see some of it. Just get that. You can see some of that kind of here around the edges. It's squarish in some spots. So that's a big improvement. Now we have a much more contoured, accurate depiction, where before we had a blocky, pixelated look. One thing that we're really excited about is how accurate the edges of the blocks are along roads. In the old data set, the edge didn't really match up with where there was tree cover or shrub cover or wetland cover. Here you can see those edges, come down much closer to the road, which is more accurately reflecting what's happening on the ground. So that's a big improvement there that is helping us quite a bit in our conservation planning. Here's another site in Waitsfield. Again, old data on the left, new data on the right. Another thing that we did was we buffered houses and other development out by 150 feet. So you can see this sort of Swiss cheese effect here around the development, which we think shows an intuitive way of showing what happens in some of these residential forest areas where the block integrity becomes compromised. If you go back to the older data set, it's very square, and it just doesn't quite capture it in as good resolution as we'd like. Here's another case study set up a little different here. Old data on the bottom, new data on the top, and you can see that really there's some trade-offs here. I'll show you some things that are working really well as some drawbacks. So our new land cover data gave us a much better representation of where wetlands are. That's a feature that just wasn't picked up in the old data set. Again, we have that intuitive display of fragmentation that I think is a big improvement. The edges are much better. Like here again, here's one of these roads that that's showing us where the blocks come down close to the road and potentially offer wildlife crossing opportunities. But there are some drawbacks, as I mentioned, because this new land cover data was based on vegetation height. There are some cases where it doesn't accurately represent the extent of forest cover. So when you have trees in a very young successional stage, whether from natural disturbance or recent timber harvest, the land cover data picks them up as other land cover types like grassland, which just isn't accurate. So as a result, some of these regenerating areas were inadvertently missed in the habitat block mapping. So this is what I'm talking about here, these patchy gaps in our data set. That the forest was missed by the mapping doesn't reflect its value as the forest. In many cases, you know, as I said before, we do consider this young forest part of the habitat block. It's an identified important component in Vermont conservation design. It's just kind of an unfortunate casualty of the input data set that these areas aren't showing up as solid. Overall, though, the benefits of using this new data vastly outweigh the drawbacks. And just one other sort of disclaimer, whenever we're comparing these images, we've got to take note that we can only make limited comparisons between the two. You know, you may see something that looks like a change in land use, and some of it certainly is, but most of that so-called change that we are seeing is an artifact of the different inputs that have put into our data set. So just a word of caution about reading into perceived change too much. So again, you know, this is really foundational connectivity science that we're excited to apply in a bunch of different ways. It's helping us understand how the spatial proximity of these blocks fit together. It's helping us understand where pathways for movement might be. Here, you know, in the old data set, we were just, you know, missing this really potentially good opportunity to connect this block over here with these sets of blocks over here. You know, our new data is showing some potential there for connectivity that we missed last time around. Here's just another example up here in the top right, where that high resolution data is really showing some of these you know, potential corridors that lead down to the roads and you know, give us what we suspect is a potential wildlife road crossing. That's just something we couldn't really do with the old data. We had to rely on you know, other analyses and other interpretation of our block year data. Okay, so that's just kind of a sneak peek at some of those case studies. But I also want to mention that you know, beyond the habitat blocks, we have done a series of different prioritizations for identifying those most important lands and waters. So we took that habitat blocks data set and made a bunch of selections to come up with some of our other maps of priorities. So we'll get into this more, but you know, to big picture, we took a number of those blocks and identified them as our highest priority landscape blocks. Then we paired that up with our surface waters and riparian areas network, added in our highest priority natural communities and habitat features, and all of that stacks up to this, which is, you know, the map, the big Vermont Conservation Design map that is showing us what we need to aim for the ecologically functional landscape. And when I use that word, you know, we're really talking about the degree to which an ecosystem can function under natural processes and allow its plants and animals to thrive, reproduce, migrate, and move in response to climate change. So starting at that landscape scale, I think there are three words that really help distill what we're after: intact, connected, and diverse. We need our ecological systems to be intact, whether we're talking about a large forest block or a riparian network. These places have to be connected to each other. They cannot be islands by themselves. And there needs to be a pattern of connected lands and waters to achieve those goals. And lastly, we need a diverse array of habitats and landscape settings so that we're not putting all our eggs in one basket. The design operates at these different scales, at the landscape scale, which we've talked about a bunch. And here's where we have done our prioritization around forest, interior forest, connecting lands, geological diversity, surface waters and riparian areas for connectivity. We're also looking at these prioritizations at the community scale, which is our hotspots of natural communities and other biological diversity, whether they're in uplands or wetlands or underground. And lastly, there is our species scale. We know that for all our bigger, landscape and community scale planning, there are certain species that are going to need individualized attention. We need to know where they are or where they might be and direct some specific conservation action towards making sure those species persist into the future. So that's kind of the organizing theme, the three scales of conservation design. And that's how it's set up on the BioFinder website as well, at those three different scales. I'm going to try to see if I can get this animation going. Dave, it doesn't seem to be loading on my computer this morning, but in all, we kind of take this, as Jens might refer to it, as the cosmic zoom. You might start out zoomed high above the landscape, looking at a whole region like the Upper Valley, and then you might zoom into a specific town. At that town level, I apologize, I don't have the slide loading here. At the town level, those community and species scale components start to pop out and show you, where in town some of those high value features are. And then you can zoom all the way down to the parcel level and see, okay, here's where a landowner or a community member can really focus some effort or energy or attention. And then, zoom back out and see how that fits into that bigger picture. So everybody, has a role to play, whether you're working at a landscape scale, community scale, or just in your backyard. So sorry about the lack of animation, but we'll pause now to field any questions.
All right, thanks, Andy. Thanks for rolling with that technical glitch, and we'll get a chance to talk a little bit more about how to use this data at the municipal scale at the end of the presentation. All right, so we have a question that has been placed in the comments, and I encourage everyone again to put any questions you have and just type those out into the chat section. This is from Deb Shelby, and the question is, so we are actively trying to identify areas in Bolton that should be recognized as critical habitat areas and identify what should and should not occur in those areas. So will this tool, will Vermont Conservation Design help us identify these areas in Bolton?
So that's a great question. It definitely can help, but there may be features in Bolton that are not picked up at this statewide prioritization scale. Doesn't mean they're not important at the Bolton level. You may have something that is highly important, within the context of your town, and that should absolutely be elevated as you see fit. But in many cases, you might find that certain blocks that are of high importance for your town may be a lower priority when they're, considered at the statewide scale, or the inverse may be true. So there is a little bit of interpretation there, and the Community Wildlife Program, Jens and Dave are definitely available to help do that level of interpretation to help you understand what Vermont Conservation Design can and can't do for your town level efforts.
All right, thanks for that, Andy. We have one guest who has to leave, was asking about recording, and these presentations are recorded. I'll just mention that there's usually a delay in when we're able to put those out, but we ultimately post those on the website, and we have a YouTube channel with all of our recorded webinars. So this will be available for you. So sorry, Mark, this you need to drop. No worries, we understand. But this will be available so you can come back and check. Great. Any other questions at this time for Andy before we jump into our third segment? If you'd like to raise your hand, we can go straight to a question, or you can place it in the chat.
All right, let's keep rolling. You'll have another shot at me. Okay, so this next section is going to dive into some of those component or parts. You know, we've shown you kind of that big picture map, the greens and the grays there. That's all the different components stacked up together. But you know, each of these different components has its own map and its own prioritization. You can think of these as the reasons why certain forests or waters were called out as high priority or priority in the overall design. And we have a bunch that we're going to go into here. Keep in mind, you know, it is useful to break these apart to learn about how they were selected, how they were built. But overall, the whole design is not exactly meant to be an a la carte menu. You know, you can't just work on interior forest alone if you're going after the ecologically functional landscape. You have to factor in all these other pieces and how they fit together. So that said, let's dive into the individual components. Interior forest is an ecological condition that is under threat from fragmentation. So this was something that we needed to elevate in the design. Now, how this was built, again, we started with that habitat blocks data set, and we looked at that data set by biophysical region. So Vermont is separated into different biophysical regions that you know divide the state up based on different features. And so you know what makes up interior forest in Champlain Valley is going to look really different than if you're in the southern Green Mountains where you have these massive national forest blocks. So it's not really fair to compare some of these regions to each other tit for tat. You have to set different thresholds, you know, based on what region you're working in. So you know, we had different acreages for each biophysical region. If the habitat block had enough forest block or interior forest or had enough size, it would get bumped into highest priority or priority. If it didn't have enough, it wouldn't, you know, make the cut into that top priority. And here's the output map of those highest priority and priority interior forest blocks. You can see that by and large, you know, many of our highest priority interior forest blocks are along the mountain ranges and in the Northeast Kingdom. But because we use those different acreage thresholds in the valleys, you know, we still do have high priority blocks down in the valleys. Even though they're smaller, they are of high value for biological diversity. So, you know, we wanted to make sure they weren't just ruled out by size alone. The next data set is our connectivity blocks component. And again, this was a subset of the habitat blocks that were selected to promote landscape connectivity across Vermont and into the neighboring states and provinces. So, you know, when we sort of look at the landscape, you know, we know that certain blocks are currently better connected to others than in some other places. And so that pathway is kind of obvious. In other places, it's a little more tenuous. There might be, you know, a gap between blocks and you know, it's not quite so obvious. So some of these really pop out as high priority and others priority and some not so much. But put together, the connectivity blocks data set offer multiple pathways of connectivity through Vermont. We're talking connectivity along the spines of our major mountain ranges into adjacent states and provinces. The network does connect to areas of high geological diversity. We've worked hard to represent both high and low elevation settings so that species can move upslope as needed. And we've added in some of these stepping stone blocks that, by themselves, they may not be that significant of a block, but they are a hopscotch pathway to keep the network intact. And then we've also made sure that certain really high value biological hotspots are connected to the network, like the Missisquoi Refuge up here, for example. We have a pathway from that hotspot or area of significance into the greater network. The next data set or component is our geological diversity blocks. This is a big advance in science from what we had before in Vermont Conservation Design. The goal here is to represent the full range of geophysical landscape settings across Vermont. And by that I mean our bedrock geology, our surficial deposits, soils, slope, and aspect. We know there's a correlation between that geophysical diversity and our biological diversity. So by pulling out some of our highest priority geological diversity settings, we are conserving the stage upon which the drama of life and evolution occur above. So if you think about species as actors playing out their drama, geological diversity is the stage underneath. This is the map of that data set, and it is, really trying to capture as much of that variation in physical landscape diversity. Some of these areas are inherently rare and therefore, of value of high priority to conservation planning. Some of them, however, they're not necessarily rare in Vermont, but they might be rare on a regional level, like our calcium-rich bedrock. So those are our responsibility settings that we wanted to represent in the design because they play an outsized role in our regional conservation work beyond Vermont. Inputs were our Vermont landscape type associations, which capture some of these different physical and geological characteristics, everything from our glacial lacustrine sediments and our fluvial core sediments. Those sorts of things are factored in to this data set and prioritized accordingly. We're really aiming for representation of certain targets for these features in the data set. Again, lots more we could say about that, but that's probably its own whole webinar. The next two components are surface waters and riparian areas. By riparian, we're talking vegetation along our lakes, ponds, rivers, and streams. These areas are a huge part of the network. They're very complementary to our forest blocks and are hitting on a lot of our aquatic and water quality and flood protection values of the design. There's another component, riparian connectivity. This is another data set we've improved quite a bit this time around, where we are focusing on those areas that are actually currently vegetated within the surface water and riparian areas network. So these are the most functional places for some of those fish and wildlife habitats. And in some places, the riparian network of connectivity may be, more significant than in some other places where you may not have large forest blocks left. Your riparian network may be your most significant natural areas, or they may be the main pathway between forest blocks along a riparian path. So that's kind of a wrap up of the landscape scale. We're kind of zooming high over them. And the next scale that I alluded to, we're going to skim over even more rapidly. But at the community and species scale, just know that we are mapping and incorporating and prioritizing things like natural communities, young and old forest, aquatic habitats, vernal pools, wetlands, wildlife road crossings, grasslands and shrublands, underground habitats, and of course our rare threatened and endangered species. And the natural communities are a big part of this. They are interacting assemblages of organisms, their physical environment, and the natural processes that affect them. We name them after the most dominant species, and some of them are inherently rare on the landscape, such as our limestone bluff cedar pine forests, like this one at Rock Point. Others are quite common, like our northern hardwood forests, which are ubiquitous in certain parts of the state. We've made some significant advances in our wildlife road crossings data set. These are segments of road that are prioritized because of the quality of cover on both sides of the road is where the wildlife are most likely to cross over the road or under the road if they have appropriate infrastructure. There's some really neat methodology on the back end here. We created a grid of plots on either side of the road and then analyzed the percent of habitat block data set that is filling up the grid there. Those segments that have a higher percentage of habitat block on both sides were flagged as our highest priority wildlife road crossings. So we had a couple different thresholds for determining, how much habitat block needed to be in those grids to get to the highest priority or potential wildlife road crossings. So that's kind of what it looks like on the back end. A next step of processing, we sort of convert that to different symbology for the lines, and you can see how it's shown in BioFinder as well. The wildlife road crossings is a great issue for thinking about how Vermont Conservation Design can touch down on these overlapping issues that we introduced first thing in this webinar. Adapting to climate change is really forcing our hand on a number of these issues. So, while we think about it from a wildlife crossing perspective, many of our partners are thinking about, how do we keep road infrastructure from withstanding these storms that are becoming, unfortunately, more and more normal? We learned a lot of lessons about how you could appropriately size infrastructure after Tropical Storm Irene, and how that could also help with our efforts to connect habitat on either side of the road for fish and wildlife. So these sorts of investments are saving us money by keeping it so we don't need to routinely replace these structures after every major storm, and they're also helping us achieve some of our biological goals. And I think this is just a good sort of microcosm of some of the work we're doing in Vermont Conservation Design, how it can touch down on multiple areas of our conservation and municipal planning. So that's all I have. I'm going to turn it over to Dave here in a minute, but I'm happy to answer any questions that have come up.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Andy. Okay, so we've got a couple of questions and a raised hand, which is excellent. We have one question that is from earlier. It was placed in the chat. In Waterbury, it appears that 2/3 of our town falls into one or more high priority areas. So how do we deal with that? And I'll send this question to you to see if you have any comments, Andy, but I'll also note that we're going to talk about this a little bit in the next section. But you have any thoughts that you'd like to share on that right now?
Yeah, I think there's kind of a couple ways of looking at it. One of it is that you have a really huge opportunity to play a part in this ecologically functional landscape. On a more practical level, I think Dave and Jens are available to help you interpret that. What does that mean? You probably need some additional town level prioritization to help you figure out which of those is most important on that town level scale. We're looking at it statewide, hundreds of towns, different mountain ranges, different biophysical regions, and you have knowledge about Waterbury that we may not have from our offices. So that's 100% what the community wildlife program is available to help with, and I encourage you to reach out.
Great, thank you. Next questions from the chat. We're actually getting a couple questions about using BioFinder. So we're not going to answer those right now, but I will give a little plug that this webinar presentation today is about understanding Vermont Conservation Design, but we also have some upcoming webinars that are focused on actually specifically how to use that BioFinder tool and sort of the mechanics of how that tool works. So if you want to find more, you can reach out to us, or you can also look at one of those webinars. Okay, so let's go to, we have one raised hand, and I'm trying to see who that is. It's Carissa. Feel free, if you'd like to take yourself off mute and ask your question, go ahead.
Yeah, my question was just, is there a difference in interior forest block conditions, or I guess benefits, and just regular forest block benefits and like ecological services?
So I think the way we've prioritized interior forest is focusing on the idea that as you get to the edge of the forest, certain conditions change. You might have more light on the edge of the forest, or you may have a difference in moisture in the leaf litter. So there are things that you can describe that might differ from the interior to the edge, but a lot of that's going to depend on the site and what kind of vegetation is there, what was the past land use history. So it's a really good question, and I think the answer, unfortunately, is it depends. It depends on the site, it depends on the block, yeah, thanks for that question.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think there's a lot of science that shows that the size of a landscape does have a correlation with the biodiversity that it can support as well. And we know that there are many species in Vermont that their needs generally, they'll have a harder time meeting their biological needs if they only have access to small patchy landscapes versus the sort of what we associate with what Andy was talking about, the deep dark woods in the center of a forest block where you don't have any of those edge effects potentially competing. We have one more question for you, Andy, before we jump into our last segment, and that is there any documentation in VCD on the impact of outdoor recreation on critical habitat?
Can you say that again? You cut out for just a second.
Yeah, is there any documentation in VCD on the impact of outdoor recreation on critical habitat?
Let me think. I don't think we have any specific metrics built in, but there has been quite a bit of research done on this. And a number of years ago, we had a graduate student working with the department on doing a very massive literature review. That person, Meredith Naughton, now works for the Forest Service, and there was a publication that came out of that. So that resource does exist. And we certainly are thinking about that when we're thinking about how to manage specific parts of the network in VCD, but it's not really a core piece of this round of analysis. And I don't know, Dave, maybe you have that report somewhere kicking around. We can post a link to.
Yeah, I'll see if I don't have it at easy access, but maybe I can sneak it in before we close today. But great question, and there's it's also an evolving science. But that Naughton report is a really excellent resource. We'll try to find that. All right, thank you, Andy. Andy, are you seeing my screen?
Yep, looks good, Dave.
All right, perfect. So we're going to jump into our last segment here. And what we'd like to do is close out the session today by exploring a little bit more, how you can take this Vermont Conservation Design information and really apply it at the municipal scale. So one of the beautiful things about Vermont, and also one of the challenges in terms of conservation work, is that so much of our land use planning really happens at the town level. So local action is key to our conservation efforts, but if we want to preserve this larger fabric of interconnected forest blocks and wildlife corridors and this overall ecologically functional landscape statewide that Andy was talking about, we really need cooperation across state boundaries. And so that's where Vermont Conservation Design can really offer a lot. And it can help us live up to sort of both sides of our state motto, right? We can display a certain level of unity in the direction of our conservation decisions, even as we exercise freedoms in the municipal sphere to preserve each town's unique character. So across Vermont, VCD really allows us to coordinate between all different kinds of organizations, from state government agencies to land trusts and conservation nonprofits, municipalities, volunteer and local action groups, and all the way down to individual landowners who can understand, where their land may fit into this larger context. Now, Andy reminded us earlier in the presentation that Vermont Conservation Design is not an a la carte menu. We really need all of these components adding up to the ecologically functional landscape in order to make it work. But at the same time, not everybody needs to do everything everywhere all at the same time. So by setting a unifying vision as this state conservation framework, right, VCD really allows different organizations and initiatives, towns potentially to specialize in their focus and understand how that work may fit in effectively to the larger vision and this division of labor. So the Wild Turkey Foundation can be looking at where young forests are around the state and understanding that that is a really important component that's needed alongside all of these other components. All right, so we want to give you a quick roadmap for the sort of most effective way to apply Vermont conservation design at the municipal scale that's really broadly applicable to most conservation projects. And we'll note that BioFinder has come up a number of times. This tool, it's a free mapping application that allows you to see this data. So we have some screenshots from BioFinder that will be in this segment. But the first piece of this is to really use these landscape level overall priorities to help you understand the larger context of the town or the county or whatever region you're working in. So you can look at this overall priorities map that Vermont Conservation Design provides at that landscape level to get directed as to sort of where the highest priorities are in the landscape in the first place and what kind of context the town might be in. The second thing to do is to take that overall priorities and unpack it into these different landscape level components that Andy told us about. So where are the interior forest blocks? Where are the connectivity blocks, right? What are the ecological values and ecological functions that are represented on the landscape? And that's a really important step to understand and will help us understand some of these questions about, what if my town is 2/3 highest priority? The next thing to do is to zoom in farther and identify these smaller scale elements that are mapped in your area. So we can look at the VCD community and species level components and understand where there are wetlands, where there are rare, threatened, endangered species that are known and mapped, where they're mapped natural communities. And this is going to be really helpful. But as Andy alluded to, it's useful to recognize that there are some limitations and that this is a statewide data set. And we're necessarily going to be missing some of the fine level detail that the towns have access to. So it's really important to draw upon local knowledge and local natural resource inventories and bring that information into your process to supplement what you might be able to access from the Vermont conservation data that's out there. All right, and then what you're using all of this information for is, as we've gone through this Zoom, is that our goal is to take local actions that do two things. And the first is we want to preserve the landscape level patterns. So we understand that there is really important connectivity blocks that run through our town, but that's a function that needs to be protected. So we want to avoid introducing large gaps that might compromise that connectivity. We want to look at where the wildlife road crossings are and make sure we can protect some of those so this connectivity can be protected. And if we have interior forest blocks, we want to make sure that we're not fragmenting through the center of those blocks, and we're clustering development, around the periphery of those blocks. So we want to preserve these patterns when it comes to landscape level features. And there's some flexibility for how we accommodate human use and the needs of our community with preserving those functions. The second thing to do is we want to protect significant community and species level components. Now, these are more of our hotspots of diversity, and they are sort of by nature less flexible in how they can accommodate different community uses and landscape level changes. So we have to be a little more careful about how we protect, the roosting habitat for Indiana bat or important wetlands, locations of wildlife crossings and things like that. All right, now when you look at Vermont Conservation Design data, for example, on BioFinder, you'll notice that there's two levels of priority that we use to rank these, both the overall and the component ecological features across these three scales of conservation. So this gives us this overall statewide ecological prioritization chunked into highest priority and priority areas. For example, this map is this overall priorities landscape scale, which is what you see when you fire up the BioFinder website to start. And while this is really helpful, it's also limited, right? There's only two levels. So Vermont Conservation Design doesn't do all the thinking for us. It's very helpful to help us prioritize and help turn our attention to different areas, landscapes, and understand the ecological values that are present. But it doesn't give us all the answers, and we still have to exercise good judgment when making conservation decisions and combine, most importantly, our local priorities with this larger context. And that's really a feature of the design and not a bug. So when you see highest priority features, these are the ones that are usually contributing the most to meeting these key functions of each component, while priority features are usually serving a supporting role or providing, redundancy, important redundancy. Now, in some towns, some locations of the state, it's going to be really easy to look at a map and say, okay, all of these highest priority and priority features are important. In other areas, we're gonna need to pick and choose. This design layer covers 75% of the state, which is a lot. And if we treated every habitat block as if it was an off-limits designation to human activity, right, we would fail at finding the appropriate balance between healthy ecology and healthy communities. So that's where understanding when the goal is to preserve the function and the pattern is different than protecting, hotspots of diversity. Okay, so in a couple of our remaining minutes, let's just apply this concept to a quick case study by comparison, and we'll look at two towns very quickly. So Addison in the west of Vermont and Stratford in the east. So here we are. This is a screenshot from BioFinder looking at the Vermont Conservation Design overall priorities. And in Addison, we can see that we have a really different landscape context than Stratford. And I'll just go back and forth between these and give you just 20 seconds to kind of think about how these are different. So here's Stratford, and here's back to Addison. And so we can see that these towns have fundamentally different contexts. So here in Addison, we see that there's a lot of agriculture, there's a lot of fragmentation that has occurred to the landscape. And so the priority features really jump out at us. We can see a large landscape block in the bottom right, and we can see this riparian system in the center that really ties everything together. So it's really easy to understand where the priorities are for protection. On the other hand, when we look at Stratford, it's not easy to understand that necessarily just by looking at the overall highest priorities layer, right? We can see that the whole town lights up as green. So we're going to need more information. And we're also going to understand that we probably have inherently some more flexibility in terms of how we balance our community needs and the ecological needs within our town. So remember that, after this look at the overall priorities, we want to unpack the components so we can look at the location of interior forest blocks, which is going to help us understand, where to avoid fragmentation. We can look at where connecting forest is. Right? We can look at where riparian connectivity is and all of those different components. And we can then zoom into the community level scale. And for a town like Stratford, for example, this is a screenshot from Addison. But for a town like Stratford, zooming into that community level scale and identifying those hotspots is going to help us make prioritization decisions between two different areas of highest priority forest, for example. And the same with, Bolton or Waterbury, where you have a lot of highest priority forests. And that's also where you're going to need to really bring in your local knowledge so that you can start to understand, where is it really important for us to protect the pattern and where do we have some more flexibility. So in this example, those priority blocks, even though they got a priority ranking, there's so much highest priority habitat in this area that it may not be as important to protect every feature of those priority blocks. And that might be where you can make some community compromises. All right, at the end of the day, we know that it's about a balancing act. Healthy forests lead to a healthy economy and a healthy community. And so preserving this overall ecologically functional landscape is really going to help us check all of the boxes and protect the needs of our human communities and our more than human communities across the state. Now, a couple of resources we're going to place in the chat to close things out. We've got a story map that we created this winter on Vermont Conservation Design called What is Vermont Conservation Design? It's an excellent resource to kind of review all this and explain it and share this information with others. There's a manual mapping Vermont's natural heritage, which goes through all of these components in detail and talks about how to use BioFinder a little bit. And of course, the BioFinder tool, which you can just experiment with and jump in and view all these layers. And lastly, we'll mention that, conservation in Vermont is overwhelmingly paid for by hunters and anglers and trappers through license dollars. But anyone can help support conservation in Vermont by purchasing Vermont habitat stamps or by contributing to the Non-Game Wildlife Fund. And with that, we'd like to close out. I'm sharing Jens Hilke's contact information here and my own, as we're currently staffing the Community Wildlife Program. So if you have any further questions or want to reach out about technical assistance, you can get in touch with one of us. And I'd also like to thank Andy for joining us today and doing a great job with that presentation.
Thanks
so we'll
much.
close out. We have got 1 minute here. If there were any questions in the chat that came up, Andy.
Yeah, I'm happy to stay on a couple minutes late if questions come up, but there is a link to the Trail Use and Wildlife report in the chat. And it doesn't look like we've gathered any new questions, but
okay, thank you. And I just posted the links for those 3 resources that I mentioned. All right, so with that, thank you everyone for joining us. It's 12 o'clock, so we're going to end the webinar. Really appreciate you spending some time with us this afternoon and hope you enjoy the snow and the winter and keep your power. Have a great day, everyone. Lisa, I'm seeing your question come in here. Do we have any resources? Are you still with us? Yeah, do we have any resources to work with landowners and helping them make decisions to protect high priority land? That's a great question.
Typing fast enough.
yeah, Lisa, we do have, there is a companion booklet, let me see if I can pull it up, about landowner wildlife habitat management that the department's published. And there's a lot of really good tips and tricks in there. And then of course, like Dave and Jens, are really great resources for how you work, at the town level for doing outreach to your private landowners and building relationships with the private lands piece.
Yeah, is that the community forests manual, Andy? Is that or?
No, it's a. I'll find it here in a sec.
Okay.
Since we're down to just a couple of us.
And Deb, yes, you can absolutely. Jens would be the person to reach out to. I can put that contact information in again. I'll just type that in the chat. Okay, you've got his email. Yeah, reach out to Jens. That's absolutely what we do as a community wildlife program. And yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. I got the link here to the landowner's guide.
Yeah, and there's some broken out chapters, so let's say you have a landowner who's really interested in, apple tree soft mass management. You can send them, a PDF of that section of, how they actually go, prune their apple trees for wildlife. But, in terms of the outreach strategies, like that's a great, that's a great topic to have someone like Jens come in and help with. So
Okay, great. I think
good luck.
my concern is more because we're working on the town plan now in Lincoln, and I'm concerned about resistance. It's one thing when people are open and interested in topics on their own, and it's another thing if we're identifying high priority areas and they don't correlate well with the interests of the landowner. So that's where I'm just
Yeah. No,
want to try to be prepared for those kinds of scenarios.
that's a super good to look ahead and anticipate that issue. And there are definitely strategies for how do you lead into that, knowing that you may get that kind of feedback or resistance or whatever it is. All of that is part of kind of your bigger messaging strategy, for your committee about, what are we doing? Who are we trying to reach? How do we bring those people into the process? And how do we handle those kinds of comments when inevitably they do come? So you're not alone in facing that sort of dynamic. And
right. Well, we haven't faced it yet. We're in the very early stages. It's just I want to be prepared because I want the best outcomes.
Sure.
And it is so true that you want to bring people in, and at the same time, if they're coming in with an inherent resistance, that's what you want to try to find some common ground to soften that and see if there is some way forward,
Yeah.
rather than people get entrenched in ideas.
Yeah, it's a great point, and it's a fundamental challenge. And I guess I'll just add that I think one of the most effective communication tools is to start by just understanding a landowner and saying, hey, what are your interests in terms of your land? Like, what are you interested in, and kind of where are you coming from? And if you can understand, okay, this person it really thinks about land in terms of forestry, then might be able to get them on board with the current use program and get them resources that might allow them to adopt sustainable forestry practices. Or if they're really into recreation, or they think about land in a more utilitarian way, there might be compromises that can be made where we're protecting some ecological values, but also allowing a degree of human use on the land. So it's a challenge to work when there's fundamentally entrenched resistance. But if you can figure out where a person is coming from, that can kind of start pointing you towards where you might be able to find compromise and tools that can allow you to meet kind of multiple values at once.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Peer-to-peer learning is another really useful tool for that landowner dynamic. Is like they may not have a relationship with you, but they may have a relationship with another landowner who you do have a relationship with. And so like, what are those networks? How are people connected in your small town? And like going out and walking around someone else's land and seeing what does conservation mean to my neighbor who's doing it this way. Oh, hey, that's kind of interesting. Maybe we could try something like that over here. It's like the messenger can matter and
getting
that conversation started. So
yeah, that's a great tip.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you. Oh, yeah, sorry.
I will let you go because I didn't mean to extend this beyond the time frame, but this has been so informative, and I'm amazed that you have put so much work into this, and I'm thrilled about it and trying to, understand it all more comprehensively, and then to actually apply it in our town plan is going to be really wonderful. So keep doing it, and thank you. And I'm going to keep, attending these different workshops that you guys present. So
thanks. Well, thanks for what you do as well.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Just as important.
Okay. Bye-bye.
All right, have a good day. Andy, thank you very much. Excellent job. That went really well.
Yeah, same to you. You were smooth.
All right, thanks. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, if you have any feedback or anything, I'm always happy to take critical feedback, but I think it's good.
You did great. You guys had some really good talking points in there that I wish I'd had a number of years ago. So that's awesome. I would just trim this, and end conversation with Lisa off the recording.
Oh yeah. We'll trim. Yeah, I forgot we're still recording. We'll trim the front. Well, I guess we kind of auto trimmed the front, but yeah, we'll trim this off.
Yeah, sorry about the snowblower. I don't know how loud it actually was.
No worries. Everyone's dealing with stuff today. I've got plows going by and all that. So
He was literally like snow blowing my window, 2 feet
that's
away. I'm like,
so funny.
of course, like right now, of all times.
Yeah. Hey, well, 9 different slots power, knock on wood. I got another meeting to go to, but anyways, yeah, thanks a lot. Great job and have a great day.
Yeah, you too. Take it easy.
Yep. See you, Andy.